Russia's downfall is accelerating. Putin's army is crumbling before the world's eyes. No tanks, no air power, no chance. Former US commander warns if Moscow dares to attack NATO, Kaliningrad and Sevastopol will be wiped off the map. And to top of it, another Russian MiG-31 bursts into flame, destroyed by its own invisible air force. The so-called superpower is collapsing from within. The empire is burning, and this is just the beginning. Welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Zorislava Kolesnikova. Let's dive in. Russia runs out of tanks. Putin's war machine falls apart. Russia's tank army is collapsing. On the front line, Ukrainian forces are smashing what's left of Moscow's invisible armor. New tanks. There are no one. Sanctions, losers and broken factories have crippled Russia's military industry. The once feared war machine is now running on fumes, with crews sent into battle in rushed release from the 1916s. How long can Putin's army keep fighting with no tanks left? Full story in our report.
Pilots from the 3rd Assault Unit used 2 drones to destroy a Russian tank that was hidden in a forest plantation. One of the drones flies straight into the barrel. Videos like this one showing the destruction of a tank have become quite rare over the past year, as the Ukrainian armed forces have knocked out a huge amount of the occupiers' equipment. The Russian army is essentially forced to carry out assaults on foot or using motorcycles.
They're running out of infantry fighting vehicles and tanks, so they have to put infantry simply on motorcycles or on unarmored civilian vehicles.
Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian armed forces have destroyed more than 11,000 Russian tanks. This is according to data from the General Staff of the Ukrainian Command. Only a third of the tanks that were in the reserves of the Russian armed forces before the invasion of Ukraine remain.
After 3 years of war, Moscow has depleted its tank reserves to such an extent that, according to reports, they are almost exhausted, although the Kremlin insists there are no problems with replenishing tanks. Notably, in 2022, Russia's tank reserves were stored at 24 bases across the country, but today only 9 such facilities remain operational. Peter Suciu, military observer.
The Russian Federation has significantly slowed the use of Soviet-era tanks on the front line, as the grey zone is filled with Ukrainian drones, for which tanks are easy prey. The data on the loss of a large portion of tanks in the war with Ukraine since December 2022 is also confirmed by the American Institute for the Study of War.
Russia still has 46% of its pre-war tank reserves, 42% of its pre-war infantry fighting vehicle reserves, and 48% of its pre-war armored personnel carrier reserves. Images of 8 Russian military depots apparently show that Russia has depleted most of its vehicle storage facilities, and a social media source has estimated that Russia will likely exhaust its remaining stocks of tanks and armored vehicles by the end of 2025. Russia may have additional armored vehicles and tanks in covered storage that are not visible in satellite images.
The Russian Federation is now facing a dilemma. The stockpiles of Soviet armored vehicles are almost completely depleted. About 60% of the Soviet-era armored vehicles that were in long-term storage depots on the territory of the Russian Federation have in fact been destroyed by the Ukrainian Defense Forces.
Over more than 3 years of war, the Kremlin has withdrawn most of its tanks from storage. These vehicles went from storage to depots and then to the front lines, where they were destroyed, captured or abandoned. The resources and efforts spent on restoring these vehicles did not pay off and did not bring the desired results on the battlefield. Now there simply is no longer the necessary amount of equipment available.
According to the latest open-source intelligence data, as of today, Russia has only 2,887 tanks in storage, and more than half of them are in poor condition. Less than a quarter of these could be classified as fit for use on the battlefield. Fewer than 100 T-80 tanks were considered relatively modern, while the rest consisted of outdated T-62, T-64, and early model T-72 tanks.
The Russian Federation is capable of refurbishing between 1,200 and 1,400 Soviet-era armored vehicles, but not of producing new ones. According to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the Russian Federation produces about 180 to 200 new tanks per year. But given the amount of armored vehicles destroyed on the front line by Ukraine's defense forces, this is just a drop in the ocean.
Taking into account figures from various sources, the question now is not whether decommissioned Russian tanks will appear on the battlefield, but when this might happen and whether it is even possible in the required numbers.
Kaliningrad and Sevastopol would be wiped out, NATO warning if Russia attacks. A blunt warning from former US Army Europe Commander Ben Hodges: if Russia attacks NATO the way it attacks Ukraine, places like Kaliningrad and Sevastopol would be destroyed in the first hours by NATO's air and ground power. Could a full-scale strike on Poland trigger a rapid, devastating NATO response? Would Moscow risk losing its most prized bases to save face? Full analysis in our report.
Kaliningrad and Sevastopol will be destroyed in the first hours if Russia attacks NATO. This statement was made by the former commander of US Army Europe, Ben Hodges.
If Russia were to attack Poland in 2025, the same way it attacked Ukraine, it would be destroyed by NATO air forces and the alliance's ground troops. You can be sure Kaliningrad would be eliminated in the very first hours. In the first hours, Kaliningrad would be gone. All Russian facilities destroyed. Any Russian military facilities in Sevastopol too.
The general is confident that the alliance's response to an attack now would be immediate and devastating. But back in 2014, the alliance missed something important. NATO countries allowed Russia to remain unpunished for its aggression.
If we go back to 2014, when the war began, Europe, the US and Canada generally supported Ukraine, but many countries were still too dependent on Russia for oil and gas supplies. People said, come on, don't dramatize it. Russia is an important country, it has nuclear weapons. And we then, back in 2014, couldn't make it clear that Russian aggression would not go unpunished. Even the Minsk agreements turned out to be a farce. No sanctions changed Russia's behavior. It had no respect for these measures.
Moreover, Russia's behavior became even more aggressive. For example, Russian propagandists personally turned Kaliningrad into a springboard for military threats to Europe. This was done in particular by Russian propagandist and State Duma deputy Yevgeny Popov. This summer, he released a report from the missile ship Burya and veiledly threatened EU countries, saying, look, we have Kalibrs and they fly for more than 2,000 kilometers. You figure out where they can reach.
Considering we are in the Baltic and the range of Kalibrs is approximately, give or take, 2,500 kilometers, you can easily calculate the possible strike zone.
Against this backdrop, Hodges' words about the destruction of Kaliningrad in the first hours after an attack are not surprising at all.
The complete and utter destruction of significant Russian military bases, specifically those located in Sevastopol and also in Kaliningrad, which was formerly known as Königsberg, is, in my considered opinion, a thoroughly and entirely adequate, indeed, a perfectly justifiable response to any potential and emerging threats emanating from the Russian Federation.
Hodges' warning is not a hypothetical assumption. NATO has long been preparing for possible aggression specifically from Kaliningrad. In late September, Poland and Sweden, for example, practiced the defense of Gotland Island, a key security element in the Baltic region, which is located just 300 kilometers from Kaliningrad. These military exercises were designed to send a clear signal about readiness for joint defense in the Baltic Sea. Warning signals are also being sent to Russia by the current high-ranking NATO command. The commander of the US Army in Europe and Africa, General Christopher Donahue, also stated that the alliance could wipe out the Kaliningrad region in extremely short order. If such a need arises, he added that they have already planned everything.
General Donahue said the following about Kaliningrad back in August, that in case of anything, if someone is thinking about hybrid provocations on the eastern flank, the alliance has operational plans ready that will allow NATO forces in Europe to literally turn Kaliningrad into ashes in a few hours. Well, Russian propaganda, of course, immediately went up the wolves, started howling that it was a provocation, a direct threat, and so on. But this statement by an active American general, and one who holds a position in NATO's military command, is a very direct and clear signal to the bunker and the swamps that everyone sees what you are doing, and everyone sees what you are preparing for. And don't think that only you are preparing.
But it's worth noting here that probably the destruction of cities is a bit of an exaggeration. It's doubtful that NATO would undertake to incinerate cities, and it's simply difficult to do. But the fact that military targets will be ordered to cease to exist is a fact.
Talking about the destruction of cities in general is probably not necessary because, firstly, the terrain is quite complex, and secondly, it would require not just a dozen particularly powerful bombs, including even tactical nuclear warheads, but the pinpoint elimination of docks, extensive warehouses, numerous berths, and various military ships located there, all contributing to its strategic importance. It is a perfectly feasible task.
In fact, Tomahawks will have plenty of room to operate. There are especially many military targets on the Baltic Sea coast. Aviation, communication troops, and repair factories are concentrated here, and Russia should think about the consequences. But is that in the spirit of the Kremlin?
Russian MiG-31 crashes, another self-destruction in the sky. Another day, another crash. A Russian MiG-31 fighter jet went down in the Lipetsk region, and as usual, not because of enemy fire. The crew ejected just in time, but the jet was completely destroyed. Why is Moscow's military hardware falling apart midair? Full story in our report.
Russians have destroyed yet another fighter jet with their own hands.
A MiG-31 fighter jet has crashed in Russia. The disaster occurred in the Lipetsk region. The crew managed to eject in time. It seems Russia has a new tradition now. MiGs take off only to make a spectacular crash landing.
The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed the information, but of course did not name the cause of the crash.
This is also a problem of the Russian military-industrial complex. There are issues with supplying spare parts, problems with maintaining the aircraft fleet, and accordingly the fleet itself. For the most part, these are already outdated aircraft of the Russian aerospace forces that have already exceeded their operational lifespan. That's why the accident rate among Russian aerospace forces aircraft is so high.
But the most interesting thing is that this is already the fourth military plane to crash since the beginning of this year. The first was a Su-25.
According to preliminary reports, the cause of the incident was a technical malfunction.
A month later, in April, a Tu-22M3 missile-carrying bomber crashed in Irkutsk. And the same fate befell the third Su-34 fighter to crash this year.
The reason was trivial. The landing gear failed to deploy. While the navigator was trying to revive the landing gear, time was ticking away. He ejected, but as they say, he landed on meaning alone.
Even without Ukraine's help, Russians are quite successful at destroying themselves and their own equipment. But what is the cause of such disasters?
It's a matter of comprehensive pressure from Western countries, primarily the United States. Accordingly, the European Union, through its comprehensive sanction packages, effectively prevents the Russian side from fully and completely supplying essential spare parts to the Russian aerospace forces, thereby significantly impacting their operational capabilities. I want to emphasize once again that this problem also exists in civil aviation. Moreover, at this particular point in time, all concerted attempts to successfully implement so-called import substitution programs have essentially and unequivocally failed. Hiro.
But wait, the Kremlin old man is convinced that everything is just fine with Russia's combat aviation. They even managed to share it.
And now, despite the fact that we ourselves need combat aviation in the context of the special military operation, I do not believe that our aviation industry enterprises are oversized. Not only do we fully meet the needs of the armed forces of the Russian Federation today, thank you, but we also supply the necessary equipment for export. It is in great demand.
At the moment, it should be noted that the Russian Federation has significantly lost its position precisely because of the inability to scale up production of the very latest advanced fighter jets and other related essential items for the operational needs of foreign partners. It should be noted that at the moment, the so-called Indian contracts are at risk of falling through.
Well, okay, maybe things are better with civil aviation in Russia?
Today they're offering you flying coffins, and tomorrow you won't even have that. At least 4 million people will suddenly and unexpectedly lose the essential ability to get crucial medical care, receive vital life-saving cargo, or spend their leisurely summer on a warm, inviting seashore.
But it seems not. There are fewer and fewer operational civil aircraft in Russia, and by 2030 the country risks losing half of its fleet altogether.
Without foreign components, aviation is literally suffocating. Sanctions have cut Russia off from Boeing, Airbus and their services, while domestic engines and electronics remain only on paper. This is not just a failure of the industry, it's a diagnosis for the entire Russian economy.
The same goes for spending. Next year, the budget for aircraft production and repair will be reduced by 1.5 times.
The country is effectively sliding backwards and losing its leading position in the global aircraft manufacturing market. Moreover, the Russian Federation is currently unable to even make up for the shortage of aircraft on its domestic markets.
They promised it by the end of 2025, but unfortunately they miscalculated. In Russia, the certification deadlines for the new Il-114 aircraft have once again been missed. But the reason for the delay, strangely enough, is a lack of components, resources, and technology.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. If you stand for truth over propaganda, like, comment and subscribe. Want to do more? Become a sponsor and help us keep exposing the lies of the Kremlin. Your support powers our reporting, strengthens Ukrainians' voice and keeps the world informed. Stay strong, stay informed and stay with Ukraine.